Bravo. And I hope you're able to see how much he was enjoying this. Because when a person plays with joy like that, he's dancing all over this place. And it was wonderful to see. Ricardo. Thank you. Let me read to us from the Gospel of St. John in the 11th chapter. I'm going to read a few verses at first, and then we'll skip over to the 17th verse. Now, a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." Then in the 17th verse, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you asked." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection, and I am life. The one who believes in me will live even though he die. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God who is to come into the world." And then skipping down into the 38th verse. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor. He has been there 4 days." And Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with the strips of linen, cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes. Let him go." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I'm not sure exactly what the man meant to say. He seems to have been a bit confused. He explained his forthcoming absence from work in a note to his boss that said, "I'm having my autopsy tomorrow, but with any luck, I'll be in the following day." It would take a lot of luck indeed. I don't know exactly what kind of medical procedure he was having, maybe a biopsy, but very few people are able to return to work the day after their autopsy. On the other hand, as we start this series on Life Unbound, this morning we have the testimony of a man named Lazarus, perhaps as we should refer to him, the not so late Mr. Lazarus. For as John's gospel tells us, Lazarus was not just dead for a few hours, such as the widow's son in Nain or Jairus' daughter in Capernaum. He'd already been buried and was in the tomb for 4 days. As Jerry Clower used to say, he was graveyard cold in the ground dead. As dead as all those brown and brittle tropical plants in Houston after the big freeze. His sisters knew it. His neighbors knew it. Everybody knew it, in fact, but Jesus. And we don't know what he died of. Some say he might have had leprosy. Indeed, some say he was the son of Simon the leper, another man from Bethany, a little village whose name means house of affliction, place where Jesus came to dine one night. That might also explain why Lazarus, along with his two sisters, Mary and Martha, were all still apparently single and living together, maybe in that same house of their father. Others say he might have had a different condition. Jean Vanier, the Catholic theologian from Canada who founded l'Arche, an international federation for people with developmental disabilities. He once suggested Lazarus had some sort of a physical or learning difficulty. He never speaks in the gospel, for instance. Maybe that's why he was still unmarried. An unusual status at that time. Alternately, one of my seminary classmates, who now teaches at Asbury Seminary, proposed that it was Lazarus and not John who was actually the beloved disciple mentioned in this fourth gospel. According to my friend Ben, that's exactly how the sisters describe him here in verse 3. Lord, the one whom you love is sick. Or whatever the truth might have been. What's clear is that Lazarus indeed died and was buried. Which means Jesus didn't simply revive a man who had been passed out and needed something to wake him up once more. Nor did Jesus cry out, clear, and then put the paddles onto Lazarus to shock him back to life after having a heart attack or seizure. No, Jesus shocked everybody else instead, especially those who were the closest to the miracle, that is, to Lazarus and to his sisters, Mary and Martha. For you see, what happened on that day changed and restored all of their lives as much as Jesus quite literally changed and restored the life of this man Lazarus. First of all, for instance, those two sisters came to know in their hearts that Jesus genuinely cares about us and about what happens to us, even when it may not seem so. When Lazarus took ill and began to worsen, St. John tells us, Mary and Martha's first response was simply to turn to Jesus and to ask for his help. They'd seen him work before. They knew what kind of miracles he was capable of doing. They'd listened for many hours to all the things which he said and taught. They had no doubt. Personally talked with him often. And we know that Jesus regularly seems to have spent the night in their home in Bethany, the little village on the Mount of Olives, just across the valley from the city of Jerusalem, 2 miles is all. And through it all, they had come to put their trust in this man, just as each of us must come to do as well. And so when the crisis came, as it does to each of us, they knew just what to do. They turned to the Lord, not to besiege Jesus with their pleas. They didn't tell him exactly what he ought to do or how he ought to do it. They simply let the master know they had a need. Their brother was sick. Dear friends, so very often, that's all we have to do as well. Simply go to God, let him know we have a need, or more to the point, since he already knows that anyway, that we're trusting him to meet that need. The shortest and simplest prayers are often the most sincere ones. That's what makes them acceptable and pleasing in God's sight. So Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus, who was staying about 20 miles away or so in another town called Bethany, this one on the other side of the Jordan River, close to Jericho. And then they waited. Only Jesus didn't come right away. And he didn't come the next day, or that night, or the day that followed that. Jesus waited 3 days, in fact. And as Mary and Martha watched their brother slip away from them, there was still no sign of him, no sign from him, not even a return word from him. Perhaps they began to realize Jesus was not going to come at all this time, until finally the unthinkable happened. There it is, their brother died. Those sisters put their trust in Jesus, and Jesus let them down. Maybe you've been there. Felt let down by Jesus at some time in your life too. Perhaps you had a need that you knew Jesus could meet, and yet he didn't, despite all your prayers and all your pleas. Maybe a business failed, or a relationship went south, or a marriage dissolved. Perhaps, like Lazarus, someone whom you loved got sick. And even after you prayed for that person, day and night, they still died. And so we can all pretty much imagine how Mary and Martha must have felt at that point. They had called out to Jesus, only Jesus didn't say yes, and he didn't say no, he didn't even say wait or maybe, or what parents always say, we'll see. He just didn't say anything at all. That's the hardest kind of response, isn't it? And when he was needed the most, Jesus did not come. He didn't even show up for the funeral. The neighbors all came. The friends came. The professional mourners came. Even the Jewish leaders came, which makes me think that he wasn't actually leprous. But Jesus was not there. So if ever the sisters had a good reason to stop believing in Jesus and grow cold and bitter in their hearts towards him, or think that Jesus doesn't really care that much about us after all, this was it. If they could ever could have understandably felt provoked and into shouting back at God, vowing never to return to him again, like you and I may do with God sometimes, this might have been that moment. And yet when Jesus finally did arrive, look at how they received him. Martha heard the news that he was coming at last, and she ran out to meet him on the road. Mary was still just sitting in the house. She apparently did that a lot, just sitting. And in the most tremendous display of faith, when Martha saw Jesus and saw the true look of love in his eyes, I suspect, she threw herself at his feet. She cried out, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know God will give you whatever you asked. And did you hear that? Martha said, Jesus, I still believe. You can do all things. What a faith that woman had. Well, sometimes people talk about Martha, and all they remember indeed was that instance when Jesus was in the house and she was worried about how to feed everybody, busying herself in the kitchen rather than just sitting at the feet of Jesus in the courtyard like her sister Mary did. But apparently old Martha must have been listening while she cooked. She sure seemed to get it, didn't she? You could say that dear old fuss bucket had a bucket full of faith. Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. And she said, yes, Lord, I know that when all the dead are raised one day. Unlike the Pharisees, or unlike the Sadducees, but like the Pharisees, Martha believed in the idea of a general resurrection of the dead on the day of judgment. But it wasn't really personal or individual. So Jesus went on to say, but Martha, you're not getting this. I am the resurrection and the life. And whoever believes in me will never die. So do you believe this, Martha? Do you understand what I'm saying here? And somehow Martha responded, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who was to come into the world. Dear friends, that's the same question Jesus asked of you and me in our lives as well. Do you really believe this? Have you bought into all of this? Not just in a general, generic kind of way. Yeah, there's a God somewhere. But in an intensely personal way. I can tell you, for example, it was not until my own grandmother died, some 40 years ago now, that these words became real in my life. I was in Boston, still in seminary. My dad asked me, rather he told me, that I was to come home to Texas and perform the funeral. I wasn't at all sure what to do. I could barely remember even going to a funeral. I sure hadn't done one at the time. But sitting on the plane on the way back home, flying from Boston to Houston, I read these words from John 11, and something happened to me. The words leapt off the page, and I heard in my heart, if not audibly, aloud, Jesus saying them to me in the most personal way conceivable. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall never die. And then I felt him ask me that question. Do you believe this? I thought, believe it? Well, I'm in seminary, Lord. Haven't you noticed? I've already been a youth director and a missionary. Now I'm a deacon. I'm going to be a pastor soon. I've studied the book of John already. I read it in Greek. But do you believe it? Because if you do, then everything else will be different. Everything else changes. You know, that was right. I didn't expect to be able to walk up to the casket in that little Methodist church in Waco and tell my grandmother to get up and come back among the living and cook up one of her patented caloric-filled feast for the family. I knew that was not what Jesus was saying to me. But I understood as well. He wanted me to know that not only that he loved me, but that he really can do all things. That's what believing is all about. It is to know that everything is in God's hands. So it really will be okay in the end, even if you can't see it for yourself. When you realize just how deeply Jesus really does care for us, just like Martha and Mary, he will amaze you more than you can imagine. Martha believed that Jesus could heal her brother. Now we have to notice that when he went to raise him from the dead, she still couldn't help herself but point out that if they rolled the stone away from the tomb, there was probably going to be a rather unpleasant odor. He had been in there 4 days already. Or as the King James Version expresses it in words I love, but Lord, he stinketh. 4 days was important. In Jewish thinking, 4 days, a soul hung around the corpse for at least 3 days. So that's why people went every day, just to make sure he's still there. But on the 4th day, that's when it was really all over. Jesus called out to her brother instead, saying, Lazarus, come on out here. To the utter amazement of everyone there, the dead man came out, still wrapped in the linen strips of cloth they had bound him in for his burial, his face still covered with a shroud around it. And we can only imagine what was going on in his mind at that moment. But notice that when Jesus called him, he came even from the other side of the grave. I love what an old country preacher once said, that if Jesus had limited that command to Lazarus, every corpse in that graveyard would have come forth. I had a cartoon once that I loved, and it showed Lazarus come out of the tomb, and just behind him, there was another man bound up coming out of a tomb. And Jesus is saying, I'm sorry, Mr. Lazarus. I specifically said Lazarus. How was it that Charles Wesley expressed it in that hymn that has become the national anthem of Methodism, the fight song, if you will, of the Methodists? You heard it a little earlier in the bell piece, "Oh, 4,000 tons." He speaks, and listening to his voice, new life the dead receive. Isn't that just about exactly what everybody this morning needs after a very long, stress-filled year? That's why Jesus then told those standing around to take the grave cloths off Lazarus and to let him go. And I wonder sometimes if that might not be the real task of the church in this world. See, every day and all around us, there are folks who have been bound up in life by one thing or another. Maybe it's an addiction or a bad habit. Maybe it's a bad attitude. Maybe it's just plain bad luck. But they're wound up tightly in the garb of the grave, decked out in death, wrapped up by all the worries of the world, so much so that they can barely move anymore. Maybe our task is simply to take the bindings off of them and set them free. See, I can virtually guarantee you that there is a Lazarus in your life. And maybe that Lazarus is you. But if so, listen again to that conversation with the Christ that the Master had. Listen to what he told Martha. Here again, what he said even to a man who had been buried for 4 days. Lazarus. Eleazar was his Hebrew name. It means God has helped. Lazarus, Jesus said, God has indeed helped you today. So get out of that grave. Come back among the living. That's what God can do. Even after an autopsy, if need be. I think we have some folks still bound up by their fears, by their anxieties, by the cares of this world. They've been panicked by the pandemic, worried about so many things. But I believe God has a word for them. It is, come on out. Step out from your hiding. Want to live life unbound this morning? You can do so. You just have to believe in what Jesus can do first. And so, roll away the stone. Take off the grave clothes. Set yourself and others free. See how Brother Charles Wesley was right. He speaks, and listening to his voice, new life, the dead receive. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.